Imagine you are a young man in the United States in 1835. You've done something that your grandfather could scarcely have imagined. You left a small town where your family lived for generations. You are living in a boarding house in New York, Boston, or Philadelphia, surrounded by other young men who have also come to the city searching for opportunity. The roads are actually navigable, even in bad weather in some places. Canals and steamboats are tying the nation together. Railroads are just beginning to be established and will soon drastically reduce the cost of transporting goods and people. Newspapers and books are cheaper than ever before because of industrial technology. The frontier stretches westward with millions of acres of land available to white settlers. Property requirements for voting have virtually disappeared, and for the first time in American history, most white men can participate in politics. In almost every way that contemporaries could recognize, Americans are becoming freer. And yet, every morning, before you begin your day, you are reminded that freedom comes with an intimidating new burden. Your minister warns that your sexual thoughts could destroy your character. A doctor informs you that masturbation could drain your body of its vital energy, rob you of your ambition, and potentially drive you insane. A religious reformer tells you that meat, alcohol, coffee, spices, and rich foods stimulate dangerous passions that must be suppressed through a bland diet and rigid self-discipline. Your employer judges not only your skill, but your sobriety, your reputation, your family life, and your moral character, and you probably don't have anyone to talk to about this, because even the idea of earning wages for a living is totally foreign to your friends and family back home. Your success does not simply depend on what you can do. It depends on whether you can conquer all these allegedly dangerous impulses, constantly leading you into what these authorities are telling you is a road to ruin. Just how the hell did Americans get here? Hey, what's up everybody? I'm John Miller, and this is another episode of How the Hell Did We Get Here? A U.S. History podcast. And in today's episode, I'm going to focus on Chapter 8 of Charles Seller's book, The Market Revolution, Jacksonian America 1815 to 1846, which discusses the ways in which the market revolution not only changed industrial society and the economy and things that I think are a little more plain or obvious, and the way instead that it changed American character, the American psyche, and things that I think are a little less observable to anybody who might be thinking about what the market revolution entailed and how it changed American life. Please like, subscribe, share, do all the things. It really helps me and helps to keep the show going if you're enjoying it. So spread the word, like it, share it, watch it, do all that stuff. I really appreciate it. But as always, I do not rely simply on one source for my material, so let me first share with you folks what I'm using for sources to make this episode. They largely have not changed from the last few. Of course, I am referring to Charles Seller's The Market Revolution, Jacksonian America, 1815 to 1846. I'll also be referencing What Hath God Wrought by Daniel Walker Howe, the book in the Oxford History of the United States series that covers this period. And of course, I'm going to be leaning on The American Pageant, which is a commonly used AP US History textbook, and Give Me Liberty, another commonly used AP US History textbook. And also, as always, I'm going to give you folks a question to think about as I go through this information, because I think it will help you to better remember and process all the stuff that I'm covering. So here goes. To what extent did the market revolution affect not only the economy, technology, and finance in the United States, but also the morality and psyche of Americans who tried to adapt to the new capitalistic system? I'll say that one more time. To what extent did the market revolution affect not only the economy, technology, and finance in the United States, but also the morality and psyche of Americans who tried to adapt to the new capitalistic system? So if you keep that in mind as I go through all this stuff, I think the information will hit a little differently, and you may be able to process all the stuff that I'm saying more effectively. So, let's get into it. In previous episodes, I have explored the market revolution as an economic transformation. I've talked about canals, railroads, factories, banks, and a growing web of commerce that tied the nation together more closely. I've explained how this new economy created astonishing prosperity and opportunity for some Americans, while also creating devastating economic crashes and widening inequality. I've talked extensively about how the Jacksonian era expanded democracy for ordinary white men, even as it further entrenched the exclusion of women, Native Americans, and African Americans. But in his book, The Market Revolution, Charles Sellers asks us to think about something even more profound. What if the greatest revolution of the early 19th century did not merely happen in the marketplace? What if it happened inside the American mind? According to Sellers, the market revolution did not simply change what Americans produced or how they traveled. It attempted to create an entirely new kind of human being, one who was disciplined, productive, sober, sexually restrained, ambitious, and constantly monitoring his own desires. This was a world in which the old external restraints of kings, aristocrats, churches, and inherited social roles were disappearing. Americans increasingly believed that they were free to rise or fall based on their own talents and efforts. And that idea was both exhilarating and terrifying. Because once a society convinces itself that success comes from individual effort, failure becomes much harder to explain away. If a man can supposedly improve his finances and social position through discipline and hard work, then poverty begins to look like laziness. Misfortune begins to look like weakness, and failure begins to look like a flaw in your own character. And this is where Sellers identifies one of the great contradictions of the market revolution. The same United States that celebrated the self-made man was simultaneously creating an increasingly unequal society. By the middle decades of the 19th century, wealth was becoming increasingly concentrated among a tiny elite. The richest men in the US were not people who had climbed from poverty to unimaginable wealth. They were overwhelmingly the sons of wealthy and prominent families who had inherited advantages unavailable to most other Americans. The famous rags to riches story that became central to the American imagination was, according to Sellers' research, largely a myth. This doesn't mean that class mobility didn't exist. A meaningful number of mechanics and artisans improved their circumstances, and some Americans did climb from poverty into an admittedly fragile middle-class respectability. But the image of the United States as a place where everyone had an equal chance to become a millionaire obscured a much harsher reality. Yet perhaps the greatest achievement of this emerging middle-class culture was that it convinced millions of people who would never become wealthy to embrace its values anyway. The middle class, Sellers argues, was not simply a category of income. It was a moral ideal. It celebrated the man who mastered his desires, controlled his impulses, worked tirelessly, delayed gratification, and devoted himself to productive effort. Churches, schools, newspapers, and the booming print culture of the early 19th century carried this message into every corner of society. The old question of whether someone had been born into the right family slowly gave way to a new and much more psychologically demanding question. Are you worthy of success? And once Americans started asking that question, they began to police every aspect of human behavior. This profound transformation of culture to influence character reached all the way into the most intimate parts of life. For centuries, many rural Americans had held a far more relaxed attitude toward sexuality than we often imagine. Premarital sex was not uncommon. Couples sometimes participated in the practice known as bundling, in which unmarried men and women shared a bed under socially accepted circumstances. Methods of contraception and abortion existed and circulated through communities of women, midwives, and folk knowledge. But the market revolution was destroying the old world of stable villages and extended families. Millions of Americans were on the move, traveling from east to west or from farms into towns and cities. A place like Boston, for example, became a revolving door of migrants, with more than half of the residents counted in the census of 1830 gone 10 years later. Families themselves began to change. Children who had once contributed economically to household production increasingly became dependents, requiring investment, education, and careful moral training. The U.S. experienced one of the most dramatic declines in overall birth rate in modern history. And unlike in Europe, this transformation began while much of the nation remained rural. For Sellers, this was the beginning of a struggle between what he calls ethos and eros. Ethos represented discipline, self-control, productivity, and the moral demands of the new market culture. Eros represented older traditions of sexuality, pleasure, instinct, and communal life. And in the battle between the two, ethos was increasingly winning. The family became a manufactory for producing disciplined individuals capable of surviving in the marketplace. Mothers were expected to cultivate self-control in their children. Men were expected to prove their worth through relentless competition and achievement, and women were increasingly expected to embody the ideal of true womanhood, an identity characterized by purity, self-sacrifice, and domestic morality. The irony, Sellers argues, was that this ideology gave women a certain kind of moral authority, while simultaneously demanding that they deny their own desires. The ideal woman was increasingly portrayed as someone who existed to provide emotional support for a man who struggled in the brutal, competitive world outside of the home. The ideal man, meanwhile, faced a burden that his ancestors would have found wholly alien. He could no longer simply inherit a place in his father's household or community. Instead, he had to make himself. One of the most interesting parts of Sellers' argument is what happened when this new culture of self-discipline was applied to men themselves. The ideal of the self-made man was extraordinarily attractive because it seemed to represent a kind of liberation from the old world. A man did not need to be born into an aristocratic family. He did not need inherited status or an ancient title. In theory, he could create his own future through intelligence, discipline, ambition, and hard work. But that freedom came with an enormous psychological burden. If your success depended on your own effort and your own character, then anything that weakened your discipline could be interpreted as a threat to your own future. It is in this context that Sellers introduces readers to two fascinating and probably, to most modern Americans, strange figures of the market revolution, the Reverend John Todd and the health reformer Sylvester Graham. These two men were emblematic of the era, as they would take the demand for self-mastery to its most extreme conclusions. Todd was in many ways a perfect example of the self-made ideal that he preached. He came from very modest circumstances, but attended Yale despite doubts from many around him that such an ambition was realistic. And he rose through the highly competitive world of Protestant ministry, this is, after all, the world of the Second Great Awakening, to become a successful minister and writer. His book, The Student's Manual, became one of the most influential guides for young men seeking success in 19th century America. The advice Todd offered was not simply about avoiding vice in the traditional religious sense. His advice, instead, reflected the assumptions of a competitive market society. A young man needed to guard his time, avoid distractions, cultivate concentration, and direct every possible ounce of his energy toward self-improvement. Success was no longer simply a matter of belonging to the right family or occupying the right social station. Success had become a personal project, and the self-made man was expected to constantly manage and improve himself. This way of thinking led to a remarkable obsession with the conservation of physical and mental energy. Todd and many others believed that sexual activity, and especially masturbation, could drain the body's vital resources. Young men were warned that they could damage their health, weaken their minds, destroy their ambition, and even bring about insanity through what Americans like Todd believed was the careless expenditure of sexual energy. It's easy for modern audiences to hear these ideas and laugh them off. I audibly chuckled more than once as I was reading this chapter. And yeah, there is something almost unbelievable about the fact that educated Americans in the 19th century could believe that private sexual behavior threatened a man's ability to succeed in business or scholarship, although there are people who still kind of believe that now. But Sellers' larger point is that we should not dismiss these ideas as random superstition or simple prudishness. They were connected to a much larger transformation in American society, a culture that placed unprecedented responsibility on the individual, also developed an intense interest in controlling every aspect of individual behavior. The same pattern appears in the work of Sylvester Graham, who approached these issues within the language of health and science rather than religion. And yes, this is the same Graham whose name eventually became attached to the graham cracker, which is one of those historical facts that sounds like a joke but just happens to be true. Though you might think of delicious campfire treats when you hear graham cracker, this dude decidedly did not invent his famous cracker so that it could be covered in chocolate and toasted marshmallows. In fact, quite the opposite. He believed that a plain and simple diet would help suppress excessive passions and preserve the body's natural balance, in the same way refraining from self-love was supposed to do. Graham argued that many of the pleasures associated with modern life, alcohol, rich foods, spices, coffee, and other stimulants, excited the nervous system and encouraged dangerous desires. The ideal person, in his view, was someone who maintained strict control over the body, his appetites, and his sexuality. Once again, Sellers sees this not as an isolated eccentric belief, but as an expression of the broader values of the market revolution. The successful individual was expected to be rational, disciplined, productive, and capable of denying immediate pleasures in pursuit of future success. What makes both Todd and Graham particularly useful examples for Sellers, however, is the irony of their own lives. These men who became famous for advocating perfect self-control often suffered under the weight of ideals that they promoted. Todd struggled with exhaustion and periods of deep melancholy. Graham's own health declined, and his wife reportedly became so frustrated with his dietary restrictions that she filled their household with many of the foods he condemned. The irony is not merely a personal detail or an amusing footnote. For Sellers, it illustrates the deeper contradiction of the self-made ideal. The market revolution gave many Americans opportunities that previous generations never possessed. They could move across the country, enter new professions, accumulate wealth, and participate in a more democratic political culture. At the same time, though, that new freedom created a society in which individuals were increasingly expected to become their own disciplinarians. The external restrictions of the older world had weakened, but many Americans responded by creating new internal rules governing work, pleasure, health, and sexuality. This process did not end with ministers writing advice manuals or health reformers promoting comically boring diets. The same desire to regulate human behavior would increasingly influence doctors, psychiatrists, social reformers, and political activists who attempted to reshape society according to these ideals of self-control. During the 19th century, these ideas increasingly entered institutions that claimed scientific authority, particularly medicine and the emerging field of psychiatry. This is where Seller's argument becomes especially ambitious, because he argues that the same culture that produced the self-made man also produced a new desire to regulate and categorize human behavior through professional expertise. Even some physicians, who recognized the emotional costs of the market revolution, often interpreted those costs through the same assumptions that created them. By the 1830s and 1840s, many doctors believed that insanity was becoming a distinctly American problem. Some observed that the constant pursuit of success, the pressure to elevate oneself in the world, and the perpetual striving to improve mental, physical, and spiritual excellence produced anxiety and mental collapse. In yet another remarkable irony, some physicians were identifying the psychological consequences of a society based on competition and self-improvement, while simultaneously offering explanations that reinforced existing ideas about morality and self-control. Male patients suffering mental distress might be diagnosed as victims of sexual excess, whether that meant too much banging around or too much choking the chicken. Women suffering psychological problems were often interpreted through assumptions about their supposedly unstable emotions or excessive sexuality. Rather than asking whether the standards of the self-made society had become impossible for many people to satisfy, physicians frequently attempted to correct the problem with the individual. The medical profession also transformed some of the most intimate experiences of human life. For generations, childbirth had primarily been a communal female experience, managed by midwives, relatives, and other women with practical knowledge. During the 19th century, however, male physicians increasingly claimed authority over childbirth, in part because new instruments such as obstetrical forceps gave them a technical advantage that midwives were rarely allowed to learn. The result was a complicated and kind of double-edged transformation. Medical intervention sometimes saved lives during difficult births, but it also transferred authority over reproduction from networks of women into an overwhelmingly male profession that often dismissed female knowledge and experiences. No figure better illustrates the contradictions of 19th century medicine than J. Marion Sims, a man who is still often referred to as the father of modern gynecology. Sims developed surgical techniques that repaired vesico-vaginal fistulas, a devastating medical condition that could leave women permanently incontinent and therefore socially isolated. There is no question that the procedure he developed eventually relieved enormous suffering. But the manner in which he developed it is a harrowing story of men seizing control of women's health and almost always disregarding their input while subjecting them to horrific pain and suffering. Sims conducted repeated experimental operations on enslaved women who had no ability to provide meaningful consent. These operations were performed before the widespread adoption of anesthesia, and some women endured dozens of procedures before Sims achieved the results that made him famous. The same society that celebrated the self-made professional and the triumph of scientific progress also produced a medical culture in which the suffering of powerless individuals was frequently treated as the price of medical breakthroughs. Sellers takes this argument even further by examining the 19th century's attempts to regulate female sexuality. Some physicians viewed female sexual desire itself as a medical disorder. Treatments could involve grotesque and cruel surgical procedures, including the removal of the clitoris, in an attempt to eliminate what doctors considered excessive passion. It is difficult to imagine a clearer example of how the desire for self-control could be distorted in a way that led to the mutilation of the human body itself. At this point, it is worth remembering the larger paradox running through this entire chapter. The United States in the first half of the 19th century was becoming a society of extraordinary movement and possibility. Americans were traveling further than previous generations, participating in a more democratic political culture, consuming more goods, and imagining lives beyond the social boundaries of their parents and grandparents. Yet according to Sellers, the very freedom created by the market revolution produced an equally powerful obsession with discipline. The individual who was supposedly liberated from the old forms of authority became the subject of new forms of moral, medical, and social control. Perhaps the clearest example of this transformation was the temperance movement. Americans in the early 19th century consumed extraordinary amounts of alcohol, and alcohol had long been embedded in numerous aspects of social life. Taverns were places where communities gathered, politics were debated, business was conducted, and friendships were created and maintained. The earliest efforts to control drinking relied on laws and traditional forms of social pressure. But reformers gradually came to believe that a free society required a different approach. They needed to persuade people to discipline themselves. The American Temperance Society became one of the first great national voluntary organizations in American history. In another of the many paradoxes Sellers points out, the movement used the very tools created by the market revolution, cheap printing, national communication networks, sophisticated organization, and modern publicity to fight what reformers believed were the dangerous excesses of modern society. Over time, temperance became more than a campaign against alcoholism. It became a statement about character. A respectable citizen was sober, reliable, disciplined, and capable of controlling his impulses. Employers and lenders increasingly evaluated people not simply by their skills or wealth, but by their moral reputations. The famous businessmen and reformers Arthur and Lewis Tappan even developed early credit systems that attempted to measure not only economic reliability, but personal character. This was, in fact, the precursor to the modern credit rating systems that determine what kind of home or car loan you might get today. A person's drinking habits, sexual reputation, family life, and general respectability could influence whether he was considered trustworthy as judged by wealthy social and business elites like the Tappans. Of course, not everyone accepted this middle-class vision of virtue. Many working-class Americans saw these reforms as an attempt to impose the values of what was, to them, a foreign, arrogant class of snotty prudes on their own lives. So, working-class folks embraced their own forms of reform organizations led by those who saw the wisdom in what these middle-class do-gooders were saying, but didn't necessarily want to follow their lead. The Washingtonian movement, which emerged among working-class laborers struggling with alcoholism in Baltimore specifically, emphasized mutual support and compassion rather than moral condemnation. This conflict revealed a deeper question that had been present throughout the entire market revolution. Who had the right to define freedom? For many middle-class reformers, the true freedom meant mastery over oneself. A free person was someone who controlled his appetites, planned for the future, worked diligently, and avoided destructive habits. For many of their critics, however, this definition of freedom seemed to replace the old forms of authority with a new and more intrusive set of expectations about how individuals should live. That brings us back to the question that opened this episode. How did a society that was becoming more democratic, more prosperous, more mobile, and more filled with opportunity also become so intensely concerned with controlling desire, regulating behavior, and policing morality? Charles Sellers' answer is that these developments were not contradictory at all. The same market revolution that expanded individual opportunity also demanded a new kind of individual, someone who was disciplined, productive, sober, sexually restrained, and constantly capable of governing himself. Whether Sellers is entirely correct is a question historians continue to debate. His argument is broad and controversial, and many scholars would hesitate to attribute all these changes primarily to the emergence of capitalism. But the power of his interpretation, of Sellers' interpretation, lies in the question that it forces us to ask. Perhaps the greatest revolution of the early 19th century was not simply a transformation of roads, canals, factories, banks, and elections. Perhaps it was a transformation in the way Americans understood themselves, their bodies, their desires, and their responsibilities to society. Perhaps it was the behavioral and psychological revolution that sought to help Americans try to achieve what amounted to success in this new, unforgiving, and strange system of the free market. Thanks very much, as always, for listening. I appreciate your time. If you would like to do so, you can contact me at howthehelldiwegetherepod@gmail.com, or you can send me a text or leave me a voicemail at 951-525-5536. Thanks very much. Take care, and I will see you folks next time.